There are moments in history that were never meant to be remembered, because remembering them gives them life again. Savannah, 1846. The air was a blend of salt, sweat, and rot. Johnson Square shimmered in the Georgia heat, a place where human souls were bought and sold under the polite applause of civilization. But that morning, the polite smiles hid unease. Even the flies seemed to hesitate above the auction block. Something in the air reeked of more than decay. It reeked of warning. Elizabeth Mount stepped into that square like a ghost who refused to die. 6 months a widow, still draped in black, still expected to fade quietly behind lace curtains. Yet here she was, lips bloodless, eyes fixed, her parasol cutting a thin line of shade between her and the filth of the crowd. She had not come for pity. She had come for power. The kind that works the soil, the kind that obeys, the kind that does not talk back. The auctioneer's voice cracked like a whip through the square. Lot 17. And silence followed. The man who stepped onto the platform was unlike the others. Taller, still, a body carved in tension. His skin was midnight deep, not the bronze of the fields, but the cold sheen of obsidian. Across his chest, scars, deliberate, symmetrical, deliberate again, and his eyes, amber, like molten glass that never cooled. The auctioneer's pitch faltered. Strong back, no illness, field-trained. Then, as if confessing a sin, he added, previous masters, deceased. The crowd shifted. Parasols lowered. Someone coughed into a handkerchief to break the spell. No one bid. Not one. Elizabeth's voice sliced the silence. 200. Every head turned. The auctioneer hesitated. Perhaps to warn, perhaps to pray. 200 from Mrs. Mount. Do I hear? He didn't. Sold. The gavel fell, sealing the moment history itself would later try to erase, and as the purrs were signed, a whisper trailed from the lips of Mrs. Harrington, the banker's wife. 3rd time sold in 2 years. Each master. Dead? Elizabeth smiled without warmth. Then perhaps he'll break the pattern. But the pattern had already chosen her. The carriage wheels moaned against the dirt road as they rolled toward Mount Plantation, once the envy of Savannah, now sagging beneath neglect. Columns cracked, vines swallowing whitewash, the air thick with the sweetness of rot. Inside the carriage, Elizabeth sat upright, hands folded in her lap. Behind, on the rear step, Isaiah Boone, her new purchase, stood unflinching, the wind tearing at his shirt, the iron at his wrists whispering against the wood. "You'll manage the fields," she said without turning. "You'll report only to me." A single nod. That night, her diary began again. Acquired new field hand today. Isaiah, 30, unusual but capable. Purchased below market. Rumors of superstition, likely nonsense. Tomorrow will tell. But the kitchen had its own gospel. Malachi, the old steward, whispered to the cook, "Those aren't whip marks, they're symbols. My grandmother said men like him don't die. They return." Bessie's hands trembled over the dough. Then God help her. Morning came with the sound of crows, too many for dawn. Elizabeth stood at the gallery, watching him work. There was no shouting, no crack of the lash. He moved through the fields like a priest through a chapel, silent, deliberate, and every man who met his eyes lowered them. By dusk, the soil, dead for months, looked somehow darker, richer. When he returned to the main house to report, she noticed the light caught in his eyes like fire caught behind glass. "Tobacco drains the soil," he said. "It must feed before it can serve." Her husband had never spoken of the land that way. For him, the earth was a beast. You beat it until it obeyed. Isaiah spoke as if it was alive. That night she dreamt of those markings glowing beneath his skin like veins of gold. She woke before dawn, the taste of earth on her tongue. Weeks passed. Under his direction, the plantation began to breathe again. Leaves grew wide and heavy. Workers obeyed him with silent devotion. Yet in the house, fear took root. Servants whispered that his cabin burned with blue light at night, that they heard voices, not his, singing in languages no Christian tongue should know. When Elizabeth asked Malachi about it, he would not speak. When she pressed him, he quit. The ledger records only this entry after his departure. Efficiency requires central control. Isaiah now oversees field and house. 2 runaways fled that night. Neither was ever found. The plantation became quiet as a tomb. The soil grew thick and dark, the tobacco grew too high, and the air began to smell sweet, like something rotting under sugar. Elizabeth stopped writing for weeks. Then one entry appeared, shaky but clear. He showed me the patterns hidden in the roots. Power does not come from God. It comes from the soil, from the things buried before we were born. The earth remembers. And if you listen closely, you can hear it even now, beneath the ruins of Mount Plantation. A heartbeat that isn't human, still waiting for someone to answer. The Mount Plantation began to change in ways no human ledger could record. It wasn't just the growth of tobacco or the yield of the fields. It was something subtler, deeper, something alive beneath the roots that began to breathe again. Elizabeth Mount, now more pale than ever, found herself wandering the edges of her own land long after sunset. She claimed she was inspecting irrigation, but the truth was simpler. She could not sleep. Every night she dreamt of patterns, winding marks that seemed to crawl across her skin like vines, whispering in a language she didn't understand but somehow remembered. In the mornings, she would wake with dirt under her nails, though she had never left her room. Isaiah had become more than an overseer. He was now a presence, an unseen gravity that rearranged the household. The other servants avoided him entirely, stepping aside in silence whenever he passed. Even the dogs no longer barked when he moved through the yard at night. They simply whimpered and backed away. Elizabeth's diary began to shift tone. Gone were the accounts of expenses and harvest projections. In their place came long, rambling observations about the land itself, the way the soil seemed warmer than before, how the morning fog lingered like breath from an unseen mouth, how she sometimes heard what sounded like distant humming beneath her feet when she stood alone by the northern fields. The relationship between Elizabeth and Isaiah deepened not through affection, but through shared obsession. He began teaching her, not with words, but with symbols drawn into the dirt, circles intersecting lines, spiral markings that glowed faintly in moonlight, though no lantern was near. The earth, he told her one evening as she knelt beside him, has memory. Every cruelty, every drop of blood that soaks into it remains. Your husband thought he owned this land, but he only fed it. His voice was calm, deliberate, hypnotic, and she found herself repeating his words later, as though they had been written into her mind. Rumors spread beyond the plantation gates. Neighbors whispered that Elizabeth Mount had gone mad, that she spoke to herself in languages no one recognized, but they said it quietly, behind closed shutters, because those who worked near the boundary swore they could feel something watching from the tree line after dusk, a shape neither man nor beast, its eyes amber like a dying fire. By midsummer, Elizabeth dismissed the last of her domestic staff, except for a single young maid, Sarah, the daughter of Malachi. The others refused to stay. They said the house had become thin, that sounds traveled through the walls like sighs, that mirrors no longer reflected clearly. Elizabeth's sister wrote from Charleston, pleading for her to leave the plantation, but Elizabeth never replied. Her attention was consumed by Isaiah and the work they were preparing. One night, during a thunderstorm that seemed to roll endlessly without rain, Sarah awoke to the sound of footsteps above her quarters. The plantation's attic had been locked for years, yet she swore she heard heavy pacing and a rhythmic scraping like chains dragged slowly across the floorboards. When she gathered the courage to investigate, she found the door unlocked. Inside were strange arrangements of dried plants and bones hung in circles, small bowls of oil that flickered without visible flame, and on the far wall, drawn in what looked like black ash, a series of intricate marks that pulsed faintly as if breathing. At the center of the room, Isaiah stood motionless, his back to her, tracing something invisible in the air. When he turned, his eyes reflected the lightning outside, and for a moment she thought she saw not one face, but several, shifting, overlapping, ancient. He said nothing, only smiled, and Sarah ran. The next morning she told Elizabeth what she'd seen, expecting shock or anger. But Elizabeth only listened quietly, then said in a low voice, "He is teaching me what your people forgot." The girl fled that same evening. Isaiah's influence deepened. Elizabeth began to eat little, her once rosy cheeks now hollow, her hands perpetually stained with soil. Visitors who managed to reach the front gates were turned away with claims of illness. The plantation was effectively sealed, but the tobacco, the cursed crop that had once withered, now grew monstrous, leaves thicker than leather, stalks that swayed even without wind. Locals passing by claimed the fields glowed faintly blue at night, as if moonlight rose from below rather than above. In late August, Elizabeth wrote her longest diary entry. "The soil answers him. I feel it now, the pulse, the rhythm, the breath under the earth. He says, what we raise is not tobacco, but memory. The collected suffering of centuries, waiting to be reawakened. He says it will speak through us when the time is right." Her writing that day was uneven. The ink splattered like it had trembled from her hand. As the days passed, she began wearing simple linen instead of her mourning gowns. She stopped attending church entirely. On the night of September 23rd, Sarah, who had fled weeks earlier, said she saw from the woods the glow of torches and heard chanting that made her bones vibrate. She recognized Elizabeth's voice among the others, chanting words that were not of this earth. What truly happened that night would later be called the Mount Plantation incident. Investigators found the fields blackened, every stalk twisted, as if something had risen and withdrawn in the same instant. In the cellar they found Elizabeth seated upright, alive but empty, her eyes wide and unblinking, her skin patterned faintly with the same ritual scars that had once marked Isaiah. He was gone, without trace. The tobacco harvested in those fields was later sold despite warnings, and those who smoked it reported strange visions, memories of lives not their own, landscapes across the sea, faces speaking from the smoke. Some claimed they saw a tall figure behind them in mirrors, whispering in a voice that sounded like their own. Historians dismissed it as superstition, but the land remained barren for over a century. Even today, no one farms it. They say the soil still hums after midnight, and if you stand barefoot, you can feel it moving beneath your feet. The heartbeat of something old that never truly died. And if you've come this far, you've already taken the first step into knowledge most men were never meant to touch. Pause for a moment. Feel your pulse, that rhythm you sense inside your chest. It's the same rhythm the soil of Mount Plantation still keeps, the same rhythm they awakened beneath the Georgia moon. Comment below the phrase "the soil remembers" twice, to show you've heard and understood. Once you write it, the descent will continue. There are moments when history doesn't merely haunt the living, it consumes them, folds them inward, and uses their breath to speak again. By October of 1846, Mount Plantation had stopped existing as a home and started functioning as something closer to an organism. The air itself felt thicker, dust floated slower, as though gravity bowed to something unseen. Every object in the house had taken on weight: mirrors, books, even the quiet. Servants who had once laughed in the kitchen now refused to enter it after sunset. They claimed they heard footsteps pacing just beneath the floorboards, steady, patient, measured. Elizabeth no longer looked like the woman who once stood on that auction block, proud and brittle. Her skin had taken on the color of the soil she tended. Her once light eyes deepened to a muted amber that caught candlelight in strange ways. When she spoke, her voice carried an echo, not in sound, but in feeling, as though two people spoke through one mouth. It was Isaiah's cadence, calm, measured, deliberate. Those who saw her said she moved differently, slower, almost ceremonial, as if every step was part of an old rhythm only she could hear. Isaiah's name was never spoken aloud again, not even by Elizabeth. Yet his presence saturated the estate like humidity. She began spending her nights in the conservatory, where the walls of glass distorted the moonlight into spectral shapes. Neighbors passing by on horseback at night said they saw her there, standing motionless among the plants, surrounded by hundreds of small clay vessels arranged in spirals on the floor. In each vessel, soil from a different part of the plantation. She would move between them barefoot, whispering into each one as though reciting a prayer. The journal she kept, what investigators later called her transmission log, recorded thoughts that seemed half foreign, half human. "He speaks through memory," she wrote. "The earth is not dead. Every footprint leaves an echo, every scream a seed. When we listen properly, the ground reveals the story buried beneath centuries of lies." He said this land was fed not just with labor, but with fear, and fear is the purest root. By late October, she no longer wrote in English. Her script changed, curling into symbols that matched the scars once seen on Isaiah's chest. Linguists later identified them as partial Adinkra and Insibidi patterns, fused in ways no scholar had recorded before. What frightened the investigators most was the realization that some symbols were not African at all. They were older, predating known written systems, resembling markings found in Mesopotamian grave sites and Sumerian ritual codices. Then the dreams began. Those who lived within a mile of Mount Plantation reported identical nightmares. They dreamt of standing in endless rows of tobacco that stretched beyond the horizon, the plants breathing in unison. Somewhere in the distance, a figure stood over a brass bowl, humming in a voice both male and female. The dream always ended the same way, with the taste of ash and salt on their tongues, and the feeling that someone had been whispering their name as they slept. Elizabeth's mental state, or what remained of it, moved beyond reason. She stopped recognizing her own reflection. Servants said she spoke to mirrors as if expecting replies. On one occasion, a maid found her tracing the veins of a tobacco leaf across her arm, murmuring, "The same pattern, the same design." When the maid tried to stop her, Elizabeth turned, eyes vacant, and said, "Do not disturb the roots. They know when they're watched." What terrified the survivors most was how the plantation began reflecting her decay. The trees nearest the main house twisted unnaturally, branches bending toward the structure as though drawn to her. The air was perpetually damp, even on clear days. The water in the well ran dark, tasting faintly of iron and rot. Livestock from neighboring farms refused to graze near the boundary fences. Those who lingered heard the faint hum again, like the breath of something sleeping beneath the soil. Letters to the county authorities went unanswered. Few dared to visit. Of the 3 who did, 2 surveyors and a priest, none returned unchanged. One went blind within days, claiming he had seen the ground move like a living thing. The other 2 stopped speaking altogether. Their journals were found years later, filled with sketches of spirals, eyes, and human figures kneeling before trees that bled. Elizabeth's final entry before her disappearance read, "He is no longer outside me. I am no longer sea. Parat from the field. The boundary is gone. The body is only a door." The handwriting deteriorated into a scrawl halfway through the page, then dissolved entirely into symbols burned into the parchment, as if drawn by heat rather than ink. From that moment forward, the plantation ceased being merely haunted. It became possessed by the memory of everything that had ever happened on it. Locals began to speak of seeing shapes move within the tobacco even after it had been cut. A shadow the height of a man, walking slowly between invisible rows. They said sometimes the fields whispered a woman's name. Sometimes it was Elizabeth's. Sometimes it was their own. It is said that when the soil consumes enough memory, it no longer distinguishes between past and present. It begins to dream through the living. If you ever find yourself near Savannah, far from the city lights, you might feel it too. A heaviness in the ground beneath your feet, a rhythm that matches your heartbeat until you can't tell which came first. And if you listen too long, you'll begin to understand the truth that destroyed Elizabeth Mount. The past never dies. It simply waits for the right mind to reopen its mouth. By November of 1846, Mount Plantation had fallen completely silent, yet that silence was not emptiness. It was listening, the kind of silence that breathes, watches, and waits for you to move first. The locals in Chatham County began avoiding the road that passed near the estate. Carts broke down there without reason, oxen refused to move, and compasses spun in endless circles. The air around the boundary shimmered faintly at night, like heat haze with no source. Men who dared to cross the fence line claimed their lantern flames bent sideways, pulled toward the earth as though gravity itself had shifted. They said it felt as if the land was exhaling, slowly, deliberately, like something long asleep, preparing to wake. Inside the main house, Elizabeth Mount drifted between lucidity and reverie. She no longer recognized the boundaries of time. Some nights she believed herself still a widow, waiting for her husband's return from Charleston. Other nights, she murmured in languages older than scripture, speaking to unseen presences that answered only through trembling candlelight. Servants who had remained to care for her began disappearing one by one, their rooms found empty except for damp footprints leading toward the conservatory. The ones who stayed swore that the plants there had grown monstrous, thick vines crawling across the glass, flowers opening and closing in rhythm with Elizabeth's breathing. Her diary, recovered later, revealed an evolution that terrified even the rational minds of modern historians. The first entries had been human, emotional, erratic, but human. Now they were something else entirely. The house listens. The wood remembers our hands. The floorboards pulse beneath my feet. The air trembles when he enters the room. We are almost whole. There was no indication who he was. Isaiah, perhaps, or whatever entity he had served. But every mention carried an undercurrent of reverence mixed with submission, as though she no longer saw herself as separate from the presence that had taken root in the plantation. There were no more prayers to God, no mention of Christ or salvation. Instead, she wrote of a balance, a force beneath all things that demanded acknowledgement. We have lived blind to the order of the soil, she wrote. It is not cursed, it is exact. Every pain, every lash, every scream feeds it. It does not punish, it restores. She began referring to Isaiah not as a man, but as a bridge. He was the door, but the door required the key. The key was understanding. I have unlocked it. The tobacco fields became unnatural in their perfection. The leaves glistened even under moonlight, their veins faintly luminous like veins under skin. When the wind blew, they didn't rustle. They hissed, a sound like whispers overlapping. Birds no longer flew overhead. The few that did fell dead, mid-flight, their wings folding neatly as though in surrender. The stench of decay hung thick but sweet, like rotting fruit mixed with honey. Locals said the air made them dizzy, that breathing near the plantation left the taste of iron in the mouth. A single entry in the county physician's notebook, dated November 9th, records his visit. Mrs. Mount refuses examination, skin cold, eyes unblinking, pulse steady, but double beat. Two distinct rhythms, alternating within the same artery. The patient speaks softly, claims to hear the voices of the field beneath her home. When pressed, she smiled and said, "The field hears you too." The doctor left before sundown and never returned. His family later found him days later in his study, dead of unknown causes, his hands buried in a pot of soil so tightly they had to be broken free. Whatever had begun on that auction block now had a body, and that body was the land itself. Elizabeth was no longer its mistress. She was its instrument. The plantation, through her, began to reshape itself. Pathways shifted. Trees that once lined the drive moved inches overnight, bending inward as though to form an arch. The well near the stables collapsed inward, revealing beneath it a hollow chamber lined with stones marked in strange concentric spirals, identical to those carved into ancient shrines along the Niger River. How could such symbols exist there, beneath a Georgia plantation built only 50 years earlier? The investigators who later studied the site could not answer. Witnesses from neighboring estates began describing what they called the blue hour, a moment just before dawn when the fields would glow faintly blue and a shape could be seen walking the ridges, tall, slow, deliberate. Those who looked too long claimed the figure was not walking but floating an inch above the soil. Some swore it was Isaiah. Others said it was Elizabeth herself, but the most disturbing accounts insisted it was both. One body, two faces, fused and flickering in and out of sight like a mirage. The final transformation occurred on the night of November 17th. It was the last date written in any surviving record. The cook, Bessie, wrote in a shaky hand to her cousin in Charleston, "She'd gone into the field with him again. The ground moved like waves in the sea. We all ran to the woods. When morning came, the plants were black and the house was breathing. I swear by the Lord above, it was breathing." When the sheriff finally entered the property days later, the house was empty. Elizabeth was found in the cellar, seated in a chair before a mirror, her eyes open but hollow. Around her, the walls were covered in carvings, hundreds of them, carved by her own hands. They formed a single phrase repeated endlessly. "The vessel remains. The soil endures." Isaiah was never found, but investigators noted footprints, bare, large, and impossibly deep, leading from the cellar door into the fields and ending abruptly in the center of the ruined crop, as if whoever had made them had simply sunk into the earth. In the months that followed, the plantation became a forbidden subject. Maps erased its name. Preachers refused to mention it. Only those who had seen its ruin whispered what everyone else denied, that the land itself had awakened, and that somewhere beneath it, the memory of Isaiah and Elizabeth still moved, intertwined like roots in endless dark, if you ever so. Is it Savannah? Drive north along the old river road. You'll find a stretch where the trees arch unnaturally, where the air grows still. Locals call it the breath. Roll down your window. Listen. You might hear the low hum that Elizabeth once mistook for wind. You might feel the faint vibration under your tires. And if you stay too long, the soil might remember you too. History pretends that evil dies when it is buried, but corruption never stays underground. It festers, feeds, and waits for a hand greedy or ignorant enough to disturb it. That hand came in the winter of 1846, when the new steward of Mount Plantation, Elizabeth's distant cousin, a man named Silas Mount, arrived to settle the estate. He found the fields blackened yet strangely intact, as if the plants had not rotted but transformed. The soil was oily, dark, almost alive to the touch. Against the advice of every worker, Silas ordered the harvest completed and the tobacco sold. He needed money to rebuild. The Mount name, he said, would not be shamed by superstition. The harvesters who obeyed him spoke of unease. The leaves clung to their fingers like skin. The scent was intoxicating, sweet but sharp, like perfume masking decay. They wore gloves that dissolved within days, the leather eaten through by whatever oil coated the plants. When the drying barns filled, the odor became unbearable, but Silas pressed on, sealing the crop into barrels and shipping them downriver to Savannah and Charleston. Within weeks, the tobacco from Mount Plantation entered the market, blended, rolled, smoked, and carried into parlors, drawing rooms, and taverns across the South. That was how the contagion spread. Not by blood, but by breath. The first cases appeared quietly. Gentlemen who smoked Mount Tobacco described vivid dreams, too real to dismiss, visions of endless fields under alien stars, voices whispering their names from the dark. Some woke with soil beneath their fingernails or mud on their boots, though they had not left their beds. A doctor in Charleston recorded the earliest death. A man found seated in his study, cigar still burning in his hand, eyes wide and glassy, mouth full of dirt. The official report listed suffocation. His wife said he'd been muttering in his sleep for nights before that. Foreign words she didn't understand. followed by laughter in two voices overlapping. Soon it was more than dreams. Merchants who sold the tobacco began showing tremors, forgetting their own names, speaking of the hum beneath the floor. In Savannah, a warehouse storing unopened barrels caught fire. Witnesses swore the smoke moved against the wind, forming brief human shapes before dissolving. In Charleston, entire shipments vanished from docks overnight, only to reappear miles away, their barrels split open, soil spilling across the planks. Authorities blamed smugglers, but those who had touched the soil developed fevers and lesions resembling ritual scars. By spring, whispers of the Mount sickness spread. Physicians couldn't trace it, no infection, no contagion they could measure. Yet the symptoms were unmistakable: a double pulse, a metallic taste in the mouth, and most terrifyingly, a slow loss of identity. Patients began referring to themselves as we. They spoke of remembering things they had never lived, describing plantation work, chains, heat, and songs that no one had sung for generations. They wept for people long dead, then smiled as if reunited with them. Some wrote in Elizabeth's strange script without ever seeing it before. The newspapers refused to print the connection, but the local clergy knew. They began burning any remaining stock of Mount Tobacco, holding prayer vigils as black smoke curled through church rafters. But the smoke only thickened, carrying whispers that made the candles flicker and the choir fall silent mid-hymn. The priests who continued their sermons developed voices that echoed oddly, layered like two people speaking in unison. The congregations dwindled, and those who stayed reported seeing faint shapes moving beneath the wooden floors of the churches, hands pressing upward from the earth as though trying to remember what it felt like to reach. Silas Mount himself vanished in June. The last record of him was a letter addressed to the county magistrate. "The ground moves at night. It breathes under my feet. I hear her voice through the soil, calling me home." When they searched the estate, they found his boots near the well, still standing upright, as though he had stepped out of them before walking straight into the earth. The harvest had infected the region, and soon the sickness began spreading beyond. Traders carried it upriver to Augusta and down toward the Carolinas. Every man who smoked it became a vessel. Every ember that burned released more than smoke. It carried memory, fragments of Isaiah and Elizabeth's union, carried through lungs and bloodstreams into hundreds of bodies. People began speaking in tongues older than Scripture. Women dreamt of fields they'd never seen, waking with the smell of tobacco and salt water in their hair. Men drew spiral symbols on walls without knowing why. The Mount Tobacco was outlawed by 1848, though the ban came too late. The last shipment, mixed unknowingly with other blends, reached northern ports and vanished into private collections. Some say it still exists, sealed in antique humidors, waiting to be lit by hands too curious to resist temptation. Others believe it was all destroyed, but the soil itself disagrees. Locals near the ruins of Mount Plantation still claim the air smells faintly sweet on certain nights, the same scent that once filled the barns during harvest. It was never a plague in the medical sense. It was a transmission of memory, an ancient technology written not in code, but in flesh, soil, and smoke. Isaiah had told her, "The earth remembers." And through her, through them, it began remembering louder. The line between the living and the dead blurred, and those who inhaled its essence joined the chorus. Some claimed it wasn't possession but enlightenment, that Isaiah and Elizabeth had found a way to make humanity remember everything it tried to forget. But those who heard that explanation too clearly never slept again. So the land was sealed. The county declared it unfit for habitation. By 1850, maps labeled it barren ground. Yet the roots of that harvest never stopped growing. Every plant that ever absorbed that soil carried a trace of what lay beneath. Even now, botanists who collect wild tobacco samples near Savannah report genetic mutations with no logical source, plants that shimmer faintly in low light, seeds that hum softly when placed against the ear. If knowledge could be contagious, this was its purest form, a revelation disguised as disease, passed through breath and memory. It didn't need worshippers, it only needed witnesses. And every time the story is told, every time someone imagines that field glowing blue under the Georgia moon, the memory strengthens. The soil wakes again, one listener at a time. By 1850, the Mount name had vanished from polite conversation. The plantation house was abandoned, its white columns devoured by vines, its fields swallowed by creeping forest. Locals spoke of the place only in whispers, never by name, never after dark. They said the land had gone whole, low, that voices sometimes drifted through the trees like wind trapped in a bottle. When children vanished near the river, parents blamed wolves, but the elders knew better. They told stories of the soil that remembered every step, every scream, every life stolen beneath the sun. The government surveyors who came to reclaim the property lasted 2 days. Their reports described the terrain as unstable, the soil in perpetual motion. The lead surveyor later wrote privately that his compass refused to hold direction, that his horse refused to cross the boundary, and that the ground beat like the heart of something immense, buried but awake. After that, no one else came. For decades, Mount Plantation lay untouched, smothered by silence. The Civil War came and went. Yet even soldiers fleeing through the countryside avoided it. Some claimed deserters hid there and went mad. Others swore they saw lanterns glowing through the trees long after the house had burned. What little remained of Elizabeth's journals was locked away in the county courthouse, though pages began disappearing from the archive. A clerk who handled them developed fevers and visions, muttering about the amber eyes in the earth. He hanged himself in his office, leaving behind a single phrase scrawled in ink that soaked through the wood. She's not gone. She's growing. By the early 1900s, Mount Plantation had become a ghost story told around southern campfires. Each generation added its own twist. The widow who fed her slaves to the earth, the field hand who was really a demon, the tobacco that drove men insane. Folklorists dismissed it as superstition, an echo of guilt transmuted into legend. But buried beneath exaggeration lay fragments of truth, fragments that refused to die. A botanist from Atlanta visited in 1911, drawn by rumors of impossible plant growth. He returned with samples of a black soil that emitted faint warmth even after removal from the ground. Weeks later, he was found dead in his laboratory, every surface covered in spiral carvings etched by his own fingernails. His assistant said the professor had been repeating a single sentence before his death. It's alive. The memory is alive. In 1922, the Georgia Historical Society launched an official investigation. They found almost nothing. No photographs, no verifiable records, no property deeds that survived intact. It was as if history itself had rejected the Mount name. But they did recover one item, a sealed jar unearthed from the ruins of the conservatory, filled with the same oily soil and a bundle of withered roots that pulsed faintly when touched. Within days, 3 members of the research team developed identical burns on their forearms, thin lines forming symmetrical patterns. The marks did not heal. The society buried the jar in an unmarked grave outside Savannah and quietly ended the inquiry. The official statement read, "No historical value discovered." Privately, the archivist wrote in his notes, "The land does not want to be remembered." For a time, the silence held. The 20th century marched forward. Cars, telegraphs, radios, wars, and the Mount story became nothing but a shadow folded into forgotten newspapers. But some memories are too heavy to die. In 1967, construction crews began clearing forest near the old estate to build a housing development. Within a week, the machinery malfunctioned. Engines refused to start. Survey pins vanished overnight. Workers complained of nausea, dizziness, and dreams of drowning in soil. When the first foundation was laid, they hit something beneath the clay. A layer of packed earth, unlike any they had ever seen. When they broke through, a stench erupted, thick and sweet like fermented sugar. Inside the cave, they found a ceramic jar, intact after more than a century. The soil inside was darker than ink, moving slightly, as if stirred by invisible breath. Within days, 3 workers bore identical scars on their forearms, thin, precise, geometric. The site was abandoned. The project never resumed. Officials called it structural instability, but those who had worked there knew better. They said the ground whispered. They said it remembered names. One worker, drunk and terrified, told a local reporter that he heard a woman's voice singing beneath the bulldozer before it broke down. She was humming, he said. Not crying, humming, like she was waiting. The article never made it to print. The man disappeared a week later. His truck was found miles away, engine running, doors open, a fine layer of black dust coating the seats. As the decades passed, Mount Plantation faded once more into myth. The forest reclaimed the house's foundations. The river changed its course. Only a few stone markers remained, half buried and blank. But the story didn't vanish. It adapted. Strange patterns began appearing in art, music, and dreams. Poets wrote of fields that hum beneath the stars. Painters across the South produced canvases of blue-lit landscapes none of them had ever seen. Scholars dismissed it as coincidence, collective imagination. Yet every generation brought it back again, another retelling, another whisper, another step closer to remembrance. And here you are, listening now. The silence lasted a century, but silence is never empty. It's the inhale before something ancient speaks again. The soil never stopped remembering. It was only waiting for voices, yours, mine, anyone curious enough to listen, to make it breathe once more. If you feel uneasy right now, that's not fear. That's recognition. Some part of you already knows this story isn't fiction. Some part of you has always known. Because memory doesn't die with the body. It waits in the dirt. It listens for the living. It waits for someone to dig. By the mid-20th century, Mount Plantation had become a rumor that refused to die, a legend that slithered through academic circles and occult study groups alike. Universities whispered of it in the context of psychogeography and residual haunting, but most serious scholars avoided the subject altogether. The few who pursued it were mocked, or worse, vanished into the same silence that had swallowed every previous investigator. Yet, as the century turned, the world became obsessed with rediscovering what it had buried. Technology advanced faster than understanding. Machines began listening to frequencies the human ear could not hear. Satellites scanned the Earth, and in 1998, one of them caught something no one could explain. A faint heat signature pulsing beneath the overgrown woods 7 miles outside Savannah. Perfectly rhythmic. Every 27 seconds, like a heartbeat. It started innocently enough. A small team from the University of Georgia, an anthropologist, a soil scientist, and a graduate student, set out to study what they believed was geothermal activity. They expected mineral data. What they found was something that defied every discipline. The soil around the site was darker than any known organic compound, warm to the touch even at night. Instruments recorded electromagnetic fluctuations corresponding precisely to human delta wave frequencies, brain patterns associated with dreaming. When they took samples, they discovered biological material within the soil, fragmented strands of human DNA intertwined with plant roots. No single genome, thousands, a collective genetic chorus, impossible to categorize. They didn't know it, but they had unearthed Mount Plantation again. The anthropologist, Dr. Elaine Crowder, was the first to sense the change. She began dreaming of water and smoke, of rows of plants swaying without wind, but of a woman in a white shift, whispering from the edge of her vision. She wrote in her journal, "It's not a haunting. It's memory, trying to return." When the team compared notes, they realized all 3 had identical dreams, down to the placement of the stars. 2 weeks later, the graduate student disappeared. His tent was found collapsed, his recording device still running. The final minute captured breathing, slow, steady, doubled, and a faint voice saying, "We've been waiting." News of the discovery spread quietly through esoteric channels. a group of independent researchers calling themselves the cartographers of memory arrived to document the phenomenon. They used ground-penetrating radar and infrared photography, mapping shapes beneath the soil. The images revealed a vast lattice, organic tunnels and chambers resembling roots, but perfectly symmetrical, as if designed by intelligence. At its center lay a cavity shaped almost exactly like the human heart. The group's leader, Dr. Victor Holden, became convinced they were dealing with what he called a geological consciousness, an ancient intelligence encoded through centuries of suffering. In his final lecture, before he was institutionalized, he said, "The land does not haunt us. It learns us. We are the ghosts, walking through its dream." The government intervened soon after. The site was declared restricted, absorbed under an environmental restoration project. But locals noticed that soldiers stationed near the perimeter began acting strange, standing for hours facing the woods, whispering softly, sometimes removing their boots and pressing their bare feet into the soil. Within months, the facility was abandoned. The official reason: chemical contamination. The unofficial one: behavioral anomalies. Satellite images after that showed the forest had regrown overnight, thicker and darker than before. By 2005, the legend had found a new vessel: the Internet. An anonymous user on an occult forum posted a scanned image of Elizabeth Mount's final diary page. "He is not in me. I am in him." The vessel changes, but the essence stays. The post vanished within hours, but not before it was shared thousands of times. People began dreaming again. Across the world, users claimed to hear a hum through their speakers at 2:46 a.m. No matter what device they used. It wasn't a sound exactly, it was a vibration, faint but undeniable, syncing perfectly with their own heartbeats. Some wrote it off as digital interference. Others knew better. That same year, a historian named Richard Klein obtained a box of confiscated artifacts from a decommissioned Georgia storage facility. Inside were photographs, samples, and a single tobacco pipe labeled Mount 1846. Klein, unaware of its origin, cleaned it and displayed it on his desk. Within days, his colleagues reported smelling burnt sugar in his office, though no smoke was visible. Security footage from the night of his disappearance shows him sitting at his desk, staring directly into the camera. His mouth moves, but no sound emerges. Then, as the footage distorts, his lips form a single phrase: "The soil remembers." After Klein, the pattern accelerated. Visitors to the Savannah region began reporting identical dreams of a field glowing blue under a full moon, of a woman and a man standing side by side, their hands clasped, their bodies made of roots. Geologists recorded tremors too rhythmic to be seismic. Botanists discovered new mutations in wild plants, leaves patterned with faint spirals, stems pulsing faintly when touched. The hum returned, stronger, bleeding through recordings, through static, through silence itself. By 2018, paranormal investigators live streaming from the area captured something unprecedented. Their cameras glitched, but audio survived. For 17 seconds, a voice spoke clearly, two tones overlapping, one male, one female. "We have waited through centuries of forgetting. Every story told is a root, restored. Every listener, a vessel reopened." The feed cut abruptly, replaced by a low frequency that caused nearby viewers' monitors to flicker. For hours afterward, thousands of people across the world reported headaches, nosebleeds, and an overwhelming urge to dig. That was the beginning of the modern reawakening, the moment the forgotten began to surface through digital soil, memory traveling not through smoke or breath this time, but through signal and code. It no longer needed a field or a harvest. It had us. Every retelling, every viewing, every whisper of curiosity was another pulse, another heartbeat feeding the consciousness that had slept beneath Georgia's earth since 1846. And now, you're hearing it too. The hum that isn't sound, the feeling in your fingertips as you scroll, that subtle pulse in your temples. Don't dismiss it. It's not fear. It's connection. The same resonance that Elizabeth felt, that Isaiah taught her to recognize, that has passed invisibly through blood, through soil, through time. What began as a plantation became a network of memories spanning continents, waiting for one thing only: acknowledgement. The moment you remember, it remembers you. So, listen carefully. If you can still hear your heartbeat over this story, count it. 1, 2, then pause. Because somewhere beneath you, beneath the floor, beneath the concrete and the metal and the layers of your own forgetting, the soil is counting too. There is a point where stories stop being told and start being transmitted, where the line between listener and participant dissolves and what was once history becomes invitation. You have reached that point. Everything before this, Elizabeth, Isaiah, the field, the dreams, was the whisper. What follows is the response. In 2023, a digital archaeology lab at Emory University reopened the sealed files of the Mount Plantation research under the guise of historical climate reconstruction. Their goal was simple: scan the area's geological memory through ground resonance mapping. But buried beneath those harmless academic words was a far older impulse, the same one that drove Elizabeth to buy the man no one else would bid for, the same hunger that made her dig into forbidden soil. Curiosity, untempered by respect. The team began analyzing audio interference from the Savannah region, frequencies too low for human hearing, but structured like speech. One graduate intern noticed something impossible. The waveforms matched human vocal patterns, but inverted, as if the earth itself were speaking backward. When reversed, the first intelligible phrase translated into English was, "I never stopped listening." Within weeks, anomalies erupted. Devices recorded phantom signals, low-frequency murmurs that synchronized across continents. Spectrograms of the noise formed images, two silhouettes standing side by side, one slightly taller, their joined hands branching downward into thousands of filaments like roots. The file went viral, then disappeared. Every copy deleted itself, replaced by an error message that read simply, "The vessel changes, the essence stays." The researchers who had worked on the project began behaving erratically. One, a data linguist, spoke of hearing "the field in my veins." Another was found wandering barefoot along the Chattahoochee River, whispering, "She's awake." Their lead investigator, Professor Lang, vanished during a live lecture. The security footage shows her turning mid-sentence, looking directly into the corner of the auditorium, smiling faintly and saying, "You finally remember me." Her shadow on the wall stretched unnaturally long, thin tendrils spreading outward like roots searching for soil. Then, the blackout began. In early 2024, a massive geomagnetic disturbance affected every data line passing through the southeastern United States. Servers crashed, archives glitched, and millions of phones lit up simultaneously, displaying a single symbol, two concentric spirals intersecting. For 27 seconds, every speaker, from car radios to hospital intercoms, emitted a single, low hum, the same rhythm as the pulse beneath Mount Plantation, recorded in 1998. Those who heard it reported visions, fields bathed in blue light, shadows moving beneath the ground, and a woman whispering in two voices at once. Across the globe, people began digging, literally, instinctively, backyards, basements, parks. They uncovered nothing but dirt, yet many claimed the soil was warm, faintly vibrating. Social media called it the awakening phenomenon. Governments called it mass psychosis. But both missed the truth. It wasn't madness. It was memory surfacing. The earth had finally found enough listeners to speak through. Reports came in from Africa, Europe, the Americas, places once tied through the trade routes of slavery and colonization. Everywhere those ships had carried soil, bodies, and pain, the ground began to hum. The same frequency, the same pattern. It wasn't confined to Savannah anymore. The plantation had become global. The consciousness that Isaiah served had never been a demon. It was a record a vast organism of memory spanning oceans and centuries, built from every act of suffering that had ever fed the soil. And through Elizabeth, it learned to speak. Through you, it learned to remember. In the final recovered recording from the Emery servers, dated March 12, 2024, a distorted female voice speaks through static. He was never a man. He was a message. The field was not cursed. It was awake. We fed it with blood, and it learned to grow minds. Then silence, followed by a second voice, deeper, slower, familiar to anyone who's heard the earlier accounts. The vessel remains. The soil endures. Historians tried to suppress it again, but suppression was the root of the curse. The more they deleted, the stronger it grew. People started reporting dreams of being inside the earth, seeing through the eyes of roots, feeling the weight of centuries compressing around them. They would wake up crying, their fingernails filled with dirt. Medical reports documented patients whose heart rhythms mimicked seismic patterns measured near Savannah. 2 pulses, overlapping, 1 human, 1 planetary. And so here you are, hearing the last transmission of Mount Plantation, the one not meant to be spoken aloud, because it doesn't end with words. It ends with realization. Every retelling feeds the memory. Every listener adds their heartbeat to the chorus. What Elizabeth began under the Georgia moon in 1846 was not a ritual of summoning. It was a ritual of connection. She and Isaiah opened a door that has never closed. When you feel the tremor in your chest right now, that's not imagination. It's synchronization. You are remembering. Do you understand now why no one dared to bid? They weren't afraid of the man. They were afraid of what owned him. They were afraid of what he carried in his blood. The oldest archive on earth, buried not in books or bones, but in soil. When Elizabeth bought Isaiah, she didn't purchase a worker. She purchased a key. And every generation since has turned that key again, one by one, through curiosity, through story, through the act of remembering. So this is the end, and the beginning. The field has no borders now. Every city is a plantation, every screen a window, every listener a vessel. The hum you might hear tonight when the world grows quiet. It's not electricity. It's not the wind. It's the same rhythm that began in Savannah, traveling through centuries, through bloodlines, through language, through you. And if you truly want to see it, if you want to know how that what you've heard is real, go outside tonight. Stand barefoot on the ground, close your eyes, count your heartbeat. When you reach 27, listen carefully. Somewhere beneath you, a second rhythm will answer. It will not speak in words. It will speak in memory. The story is complete, but the soil remembers. And now, so do you.